Good evening. We'll return to open session. Announcement of reportable action items taken in closed session regarding items 4A. The personnel summary was approved in closed session. Lars, this is really interesting. I think you should listen. Okay. A copy is available at the back of the room. I'm going to ask for approval of the agenda, including time limits, with the following adjustments. One is that we'd like to remove the agenda item number 14A for the student trustees. And then in addition, items 11 and 12, we would like to push to the end right after item 16, board communications. That way we can jump right into business and student matters.
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. That carried. So now we have public comment on the consent agenda. Public comment also includes if a board member would like to have an item removed for discussion. So I'll just first ask the board members, is there anything on the consent agenda that anyone would like to have removed for consideration or discussion? No? Okay, is there any public comment on the consent agenda? No? So can I ask for a motion to approve the consent agenda, please?
I move to approve the consent agenda.
Is there a second?
I second it.
There's a roll call vote.
Ms. Anderson?
Aye.
Ms. Owens?
Aye.
Mr. Ford? Aye. Mr. Futterman?
Aye.
Ms. Harlander?
Aye. Isn't that much easier for you now, isn't it? Yeah. So I think we'll move on to the superintendent report. So Dr. Topier, please.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So this is my first superintendent's report. So I do want to note that it's on September 11th. So I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the 17th anniversary of the tragedy of the 9/11 attacks. I think many of us can recall with acuity the moment we first learned of the attacks on our country. And I think for many of us, it invokes great pain, but also a tremendous amount of pride in how people pulled together to support one another and to find some common ground. Remembering this event, the events of that day, and along with the fact that this is also Suicide Prevention Week, the theme of which is the power of connection, brings to mind one of the values that I shared in my letter of introduction, and that was the value of inclusion. I stated in my letter that I believe all adults and students have assets that they bring to every environment, and that it's our job to uncover those and amplify them. People succeed best when they feel included and valued. A feeling of inclusivity allows for high levels of learning, growth, and openness to the ideas of others. When we feel included, a part of something, we are more likely to strive for a common good, to support and sustain one another. Conversely, we know that when people, adults and children alike, do not feel safe, or when they feel alienated, they are far less likely to learn at high levels and be a part of something. Over the past few years, we here in the TAM district have taken measures to create a more inclusive community in hopes of having a district climate in which students and staff feel valued and safe. To this end, I'd like to point out some specific things that I've seen recently around the district that I think speak to that. I had the opportunity to be out at day one across the district, and at Drake, there were students who were engaged in various cultural building activities, including drum circles, as well as microaggression workshops that were led by our student leaders from Students Organized for Anti-Racism, or SOAR. San Andreas had a whole school opening day activity that included a values exercise led by Corey that emphasized valuing each other and individual contributions we all make. Temescal and Redwood had school assemblies during the first week that were emphasized self-worth and caring. And Tam High also had day one activities all around unifying, and in fact, TAM's motto is In TAM Unity. Additionally, we as a district have taken some of the following measures. We've updated our bullying and harassment as well as our discipline policies, created and implemented a sexual harassment prevention workshop for students. We conduct the California Healthy Kids Survey for students, staff, and parents every 2 years, and we use that data to inform our LCAP. We've also developed workshops with our counseling and wellness centers on topics of suicide prevention and awareness, affirmative consent, positive body image, and stress reduction. We've also embedded gender-neutral language in some of our policies, and we've also upheld and updated our immigration policies. We'll continue to seek opportunities to be more inclusive in our policies and practices, as well as our processes. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're now at item 14, trustee considerations. First up is the Smarter Balance Assessment Data Report.
It's me. Okay. Good evening again, everybody. So tonight I have our preliminary results, and I call them preliminary because we don't have comparative data as of yet, meaning I don't know how we did compared to the county or the state or to other school districts. So tonight we will focus on just how our students did on the as we call it, the CASP, or the California Assessment for Student Achievement, which is a subset of the Smarter Balance Assessment System. Okay, so here is the overall scores. These are the aggregate scores for the district as well as each school. These are the percentage of students who met or exceeded the standard. The first column is English language arts and literacy. Second column is mathematics. This is a 3-year progression. Sorry, the slide's a little askew there. But this gives us our progress from 2015 till now. Actually, sorry, it's 4 years. To give you a little bit of a range, 2015 was the first year that we implemented this new assessment system. And as you can see, we're in the same general ballpark, but overall, as a district, we are slightly down this year, so that's something that we're going to be looking at closely.
Tara,
Yeah.
when you say you're going to, can you tell us at the site level what typically is done with respect to this data?
Yeah, so at the site level, the data is shared with the entire school, and a conversation is usually evolves around how are we doing. At the specific department of English and mathematics, they dive a little more deeply and look more at the claim areas. So reading, writing, listening, speaking. Where are the strength points? Where did we see a shift? So that data is used to then look at instruction and look at what might be missing. Are we missing some pieces of instruction? Could we augment, some listening activities more frequently? I think it's a way of examining how we're delivering a lot of the curriculum to make sure that kids have the opportunity to practice in all of these modalities.
Yeah, I noticed that the listening seemed to be a challenge.
It is. It's improved a little, and it's been a challenge since 2015. It is definitely, and just anecdotally, it was interesting that the testing company went through a series of, like the first year, different kids had different accents. Like people were speaking in different accents on the headphones to see which one was most, conducive to hearing, I guess. But yeah, I think it's something that I don't know that in high school they do a lot of that type of listening. And I know that, I know for some teachers, they started using some podcasts as a way of increasing that sort of, we process information differently when we hear it than when we read it. And are we hearing everything, or are we processing it accurately?
When we used to have the listening, speaking outcomes, it seemed to me that this speaking part, because we practiced that a lot, and
Yeah.
I think did some very good things with it, and that embedded a lot of the listening, perforce. Have we abandoned those ideas?
No, I mean, I know that when I go out, I see a lot of presenting by students. I also think one thing that helps with both listening and speaking that I'm seeing more of are Socratic seminars and what they call
hear you say
philosopher chairs or things like that, where students have to respond to each other, and often in a way that says, I agree with what you said when you said blah, 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 because blah, blah, blah. Or I disagree, and actually show that they are building off of an idea and hearing the other student. So those things, I'm seeing more of those happening also.
Thank you.
You might be getting into this later, but I'm looking at the drop at Drake in math, and I know the sites will be diving into the claims, as you said, but that's a steeper dive than at the other schools, and I'm curious if we have any idea why that might be happening.
Yeah, I don't, I mean, I've shared all the data with the principals, and we haven't had an opportunity to do a data dive collectively, but we will. It's on our agenda. And I don't know, and that is a question for the site to really examine, like was there something done differently this year? Interestingly enough, the juniors who tested in the spring of 18, so our current seniors, were the first students to also take this test in the 8th grade. So my assumptions were that we would start to see scores start to climb a little because these students have now, they're sort of moving out of the transition. But truthfully, so these kids were in the 8th grade the first time so they were also in some of the formative years of math when some of the Common Core transitioning was happening in the classroom. And I don't know if you recall, but at the time we were still taking the California assessment, and the conversation started happening of like, well, when do we change the curriculum, right? Because you're still testing us on the old curriculum, yet we're supposed to then test next year in this new curriculum. And in math, it's a big shift. It was a big shift in how we were, learning math. So there was this 2-year period where it was a little bit fuzzy and like, well, when are we supposed to make the shift? When are we stop assessing that material, and when do we start assessing this material? And so I don't know if you remember, we had 1 year, I think it was 14, where we had nothing. We had no scores. And that's all, conjecture on my part. I have to dive into that data and meet with the math teachers to really find out what's going on.
And that's where we're going to look at attendance as well, right? Yeah.
Okay, so starting with the English language arts assessment. So what you have up here are the percent proficient or above, and then down here are the participation rates for each of the school.
Wow, Tim did a good job.
So it's interesting to me that we do see a little bit of a pattern, that schools went up, schools went down, schools went up, schools went down. And it seems to be fairly consistent pattern across the 4 years. This year was our highest rate of participation. The state asks us to have a 95% participation rate. So this was great. And again, anecdotally, one of our site team was talking to someone from another school district that we usually compare ourselves to, and having a conversation about, well, how do you get your kids to participate? And then they were talking, and the person said to our person, well, what percentage of your kids participate? And we were like, oh, we have 97%. And they were like, what? We only have 48% participation rate. And I was like, whoa. Yeah, and it was shocking. But so these participation rates are great, which is good because we want to know how we're doing for all kids, not just some kids. This is the comparison between 8th and 11th grade. So this is the same students in 8th grade and then last year in 11th. So a little bit interesting that, you know, we improved here, but we had more here. So it's interesting that we had more kids at the very bottom and more kids at the very, very top. I think what will be interesting is to go back and look at, it's hard because our kids don't come from one feeder, you know, so we would have to look at all the feeders to see in the claims, like what made this difference here. And this is just the same data broken out differently.
Tara, can I go back
Yep.
to that participation
Sure.
rate, that little anecdote that you mentioned?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
I just don't remember, when we get comparative data, do you include participation rates? in
I
that?
haven't before, but I will look at it more
I mean,
closely this year.
that's pretty stark.
It is stark,
And
yeah.
I wonder whether, I would be curious to know, for a district that has a 50% participation rate, you know, what
Right.
are the demographics of this?
Yeah, what 50% is testing.
Right, that's
Yeah,
pretty,
yep, that would be really
Right,
good.
and because it doesn't, then it's not really fair comparative data for us, you know.
right, it's a pretty important data point.
Right, it is. It is. Agreed. So here are the claim levels. As we said, here are the 4 major areas. And this is one of those things where when you read through the volumes of documents, they explain why here they break it into 3 instead of 4, whereas in the scores they break it into 4. So, you know, both at and near standard are one thing, which is a little odd, but I think it just captures kids sort of right down the middle on either side of that met the standard. But as I said, listening, we're still here, but this has improved a lot. A few years ago, we had far more kids listening. This was in the below standard. And our research and inquiry has also improved. This is just an example of what, you know, this is the rubric of what it means to be in each of those categories.
Tara?
Yes.
The category to the far left where it describes reading,
Mm-hmm.
that's so general, that's so vague. Is there any more material that can help the sites break this down better?
Yeah, they do have more materials so that, you know, they have some exemplars and things that you can see, you know, that can help align, you know, assessing for this, because it is vague. Text at a high complexity. I mean, and they do, as you know, text complexity can be a little more specific. They can give lexiles and things like that. But a thorough ability to read closely and analytically is a fairly vague, you know, because I think you have to take in the totality that they can read, you know, thorough ability to read closely and analytically in complex text, right? That they can read complex text thoroughly and analytically.
I'm just,
Mm-hmm.
do you think that it may be that with the increased attendance in AP classes that are not in the science and math areas,
Right.
do you think that will help, might be a driver for the exceeds the standard group?
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of alignment between, you know, AP literature standards and the Smarter Balance or CASP. You know, it is much more aligned now.
I think the kids are seeing that.
You know, I haven't asked the kids, but we could ask them this year. You know, I think they're probably students that are, you know, so they take this, usually, depends on what school they're at before they take the AP, but, you know, I would guess, yes, they would say that the tasks they're asked to do in each of them are probably fairly similar. Reading passages, analyzing passages, you know, I think that that's a fairly similar task that they're used to.
By the time they take this, they've already had 6 to 7, well, I'll say 6 months of writing and reading and analyzing at a very high level. Whether they perform there is irrelevant. I mean, they still have a pretty
Right.
high level to work at every day. And I'm wondering if our other kids have that opportunity every day.
It's a good question. I think in the English department, they do, they have aligned their curriculum with Common Core, and they did a pretty thoughtful review of where they wanted 9th and 10th graders to be and where they wanted 11th and 12th graders to be. But honestly, there's less and less time to collaborate and meet and align curriculum. So I know that each of the sites has some type of learning team this year where, teachers can collaborate with each other. And I know that in a lot of the sites, one way that they're choosing to do that is around content area. So, if I'm teaching, if Ann and I are both teaching AP US History, or, something like that, that there's ways of sort of building in some more collaboration time that is truly specific to looking at, cycles of inquiry, looking at our problems of practice. What are we doing that's effective? What are we not doing? How are the kids doing? And sort of build in more time for that. Because that's really what it's going to take to dive down and find out where improvement is really needed, So Drake's going to have to do some deep diving in math and really look at, is it procedural fluency? Is it conceptual? What's breaking down and where? So where do we need to do some of that augmenting?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So this is by ethnicity across the district. As we can see, we still have noticeable gaps. Those gaps are narrowing, which is one of the bright spots of this year's Smarter Balanced results. This is by socioeconomic status. Yeah, so. Yeah.
Excuse me, Tara, what's
Yeah.
the threshold for low or high? Is there a
So
dollar
it's,
figure?
I don't, and high is their term.
Yeah.
I don't, and I have that same wonder. Is low as socioeconomic status is if you qualify for free and/or reduced lunch. That's how it is defined. And then anyone else. So it's low, low SES and everyone else, or SES, but it is how they define it at the state level.
Does that make it rather imperfect?
That it's low SES and everybody else?
Well, if it uses that one marker or that one metric. I mean, does everybody report that they need?
Oh, so I see what you're saying. No, not everybody does. It is self-reported. What we have found the last 2 years is if we just provide everybody with the form, you catch far more people. If you don't make them ask for a form,
Okay.
but you just give it to everybody and say, turn it in or don't, far more people will turn it in. And that's where you can capture more. Our low SES numbers have drastically increased over the last 2 years because of that shift.
Oh,
Yeah.
good thought.
But yes, to your point, that doesn't mean we're capturing everybody. But we are capturing. And this is a little bit of a bright spot that we have seen a little bit of a, sorry, I know these aren't labeled, but these are years. A little bit, but unfortunately, this was not so good. This is gender. Again, I don't have these comparative, but I just wanted to leave them up for those reasons. Which was interesting is our boys and our girls dropped by the same percentage, or about the same percentage this year.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble reading that slide. Which?
So here we are, these are the girls,
Okay,
and this is 15, 16, 17, and 18.
Okay.
These are the boys, 15, 16, 17, and 18. This is Marin.
oh, I get it, thank you.
Yeah. This is girls, boys. This is the state, girls and boys. But I don't have this year's data for Marin
Okay.
or the state. And then special education, which is, another one of our gap areas that we've been focusing on. How do we better serve our students with special learning needs? And again, a slight improvement this year, which is better than the other way. So the gap narrowed, but they went up and these guys went down. And then I apologize, I didn't have this slide in a different format, but this is by English language learner status. And because we had different classifications, it's in bar graphs. So an English learner would be somebody that is in their sort of initial learning. In the old measures, they would be sort of a CELT 1 or 2, which is sort of a newcomer to have been here 12 to 24 months kind of thing. So if you've been here 12 months or more, you have to test. So that's this group.
Excuse me, Tara, do
Yeah.
we know how many of those youngsters who come in have no literacy at all?
I don't know.
Is that worth knowing? In terms of
Sometimes
being
it's
able
hard to assess.
Okay.
And that is one of the things that and we're also in a transition period where we're moving away from, they've completely revamped the English language learner assessment. So they've moved from what the previous test to something that is called LPAC. And this year is a training year, so all of our ELD folks are getting trained in that. So we're also in a transition from one set of standards in English language development to a new set of standards and a former test and a different ranking and a new test and a new ranking system. So I don't know if the new test will be more, will give us a little more information on literacy levels.
Is that test usable, do you think, for youngsters who may have non-standard English fluencies?
Hopefully, the assessor,
Okay.
that's part of the lens that an assessor can look through. We are keenly aware of when a question has cultural implications and may be answered incorrectly because of cultural implications rather than understanding or literacy. An example I can give is, I remember one where they told a short story, and in the story, this old man was living in a house that had 2 rooms, and he was moving out because the house was too small. In some cultures, that's too big. And one of the, 2 rooms to yourself is not needed, and one of the answers was the house was too big. But the correct answer was the house was too small. Right, so I think they're getting better at catching cultural implications within questions so that you're actually testing literacy and understanding and not, a cultural difference.
Thank you.
I have a question on the second and third columns.
Yeah.
Which look remarkably similar.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you can differentiate the two, the definition of English only. I'm confused about English only. I know English learner and initially proficient, but just those second and third columns are so,
These two.
yeah. What constitutes English only? How would a student be classified English only versus initially proficient?
I'm not sure. I'll actually have to, do you know, Jamie?
I don't, it's
Yeah.
different to look at how it.
Yeah. My initial understanding was that it was English learner, and then English only referred to more the instruction than the classification. This label comes from the state, so it's a little misleading. But this would be, so if I were, a 1, 2, this would be a 3, a 4, and this is 3, 4, and 5, and then this is reclassed, meaning the CELT used to have 5 levels. And so this would literally be your 1s and 2s, and then you would have your 3s getting into 4, and then you'd be your 4s and 5s. is the progression, and then reclassified means I've tested out of level 5. But it's generally a progression of where they landed, where they were assessed on that CELT level. And it's not always, like, they're given a level, but like in the new LPAC, they're adjusting for more sort of what they call bridging, that I might not be a 2 and I might not be a 3.
Okay.
Right, and so I think what you're seeing here is that when you get to levels 3 and 4, it's, you know what I mean, it's some fine distinctions, and they're probably closer, right, and they're assessed by people, right, so I'm going to assess you, and then I decide whether you're, based on this, whether you're a 3 or a 4. But I can look up why they call it English only.
I'm just trying to figure out how, when people in the know look at this, what it means to them.
So that's what it means to me, is that we're looking at progression of classification within English language learning.
Okay. Thank you.
That you have your CELT 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5s in here, and then you have reclassified as proficient in English, so you are no longer, you're probably still getting support, or you should be, but you're mainstreamed.
Yeah, I think 1 and 5 are easy for
Right.
me to get. It's the middle squishy gray area that, I don't know what you do with that data right there, except for.
Right, and so what we do is we know who these kids are, particularly for us, because we have so few. We have so few kids that we would actually know who these kids are.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And then here's that same data a different way. Oh, wait, now I get it. That's everybody else. That was my bad. This is everybody else.
Oh.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That does make sense. Sorry. I was looking at it wrong. I was thinking that this was our CELT 2s, and I was confused by the label too. But yeah, that's everybody else. So we had 25 English learners test,
Oh, I see.
and this is everybody else. And then initially proficient.
Thank you.
So I
That
think
makes
I will go
sense.
back and change that label to non-English learners. Because that's confusing. So here are the math results. Again, here's our participation rate. So these are the 4 years for each of the high schools. And the district, again, I don't have the county or the state comparative data yet.
And we don't have a bar for San Andreas because we didn't have enough
No,
tested?
it's,
Oh,
they
it's
actually had 0
Yeah,
students.
Okay. I remember that.
Score provision or above. So, and here is the performance levels in math. Math has the 3 areas.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
On the communicating reason, I've not seen the test. So is the communicating reason section a multiple choice that involves more language
The
kind of thing?
the communicating reading, they're often asked to write, so they have to write on the Math Smarter Balance, and they're often asked to explain.
So they have to compose.
Yeah. They have to compose and explain exactly that, explain the reasoning. Why did you approach this problem this way? Okay. And again, this is concepts and procedures. This is the rubric. Just so you have an idea of what that score means. Here's the comparison from 8th grade. I think we can see a little starker of a difference here than we did in English. The one thing I do want to point out is our English curriculum is consistent for all students. So all students take English 1 through 4, and then move on to an upper division English class. Whereas kids come into math and they can be placed anywhere from algebra foundations up to advanced algebra in their freshman year. So we have a much wider range of curriculum exposure in math for juniors than we do in English, which I think accounts for some of the differences.
This would be interesting also to see with other districts, how much of this is, what other variables there are.
Right. And it's, like, again, for us, to look at other districts that are just high school, who have multiple
Right.
feeders that come in,
Yeah.
because that's, this is an aggregate of all of our feeders, all of that data compiled.
I see.
So we could break it out and look at individual schools, which I didn't do for you because it was a little bit much, but, this is all of our feeders combined into one column. And then this is the same data, just in, so that you can also see some of the participation. Here we are, so again, one of our bright spots is that particularly our African-American students are improving their performance. And while we're happy that gaps are narrowing and that our African-American students are improving, we would also like the gap not to narrow because our other students are slipping. Right? The idea is to raise the achievement of all students. So that's something we have to look at. And again, socioeconomic status, sorry, this one's not labeled. So this is low SES, high SES, county, and state for the same groups. So this is pretty stark, that difference. Gender. So this was interesting. This year, our girls slipped below our boys.
So Tara,
Yeah.
there was a story in the New York Times, I don't remember, it was within the last couple of days, that talked about students, the impact of performance, of student performance based on whether the teacher was, the same gender and or the same
right.
race or ethnicity as the students. And I'm curious, so I look at this and I wonder whether we have, because there is a difference between male and female, right, performance on math as opposed to English. And I'm wondering whether our breakdown in genders of our teachers in our math departments is different than it is in our English departments. And
Yeah. It's really
I-
interesting. Like, just off the top of my head, I would think Redwood's math department is almost entirely female.
Look at those numbers.
Tam's is split. Drake's, I think, is female heavy also.
Yeah. Well,
Interesting,
I have
yeah.
a certain degree, I have a certain amount of, I'm sure there's all sorts of data.
Right.
Right? I have a certain amount of skepticism, but it just happened to come up in the
Right.
last couple of days, and I was curious to see how it plays out here. But
Yeah.
it would, maybe if in fact we have more female teachers in math, then you're seeing the difference here, right?
Yeah.
Because one of the premises of the article was that there are more women going into the teaching profession
Yeah.
than men. I don't know if that actually is the same at the high school level as it is at other levels.
Yeah, it's definitely more female heavy in elementary, but in education in the United States, last time I saw this statistic, it was about 80% female.
Yeah, I think the article said 70-something
Yeah,
percent.
yeah, this was probably last statistic I saw was probably 2015. Yeah, so it's really interesting, and I haven't read the article, I will, because I also wonder how did they define achievement? What metrics did they use? Was it SAT? What measures were they using? And
I'm sure you're asking all kinds of questions that the article didn't
Right.
dive into,
Okay.
but it does cite it is based on a study.
study, right. And there's a lot of research around that. Claude Steele out of UCLA at the time, I think, did the what he called stereotype threat, right? And that part of that was this idea of, he did the study where people of color and women tended to perform more poorly if they were asked to identify their gender or their race before taking an assessment, as opposed to the same assessment if they weren't asked to identify those things. So it's this theory that there's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy in this idea that, oh my God, I'm not, if I don't do well, it's because girls don't do well in math, and or something like that. And so the converse of that is they say having role models that look like you, who can do math or science or things, also improves, starts to break down those stereotype threat elements.
I have a question about this slide. It's a binary option, and I'm wondering when the students take their test, if there's a box for them to check that is not male or female.
Not right now, there isn't. The labels come from the state, so we don't get to check the box. It is based on your state California student ID, which is something you receive when you enter the system. So back in kindergarten, if you started, you were assigned. So whatever you were legally entered school as is what how this test identifies you.
So if I'm student A and I don't identify as male or female, and I have to take this test that I don't want to take anyway, and there isn't even something that makes me feel like they care who I am.
No, they're
Yeah.
pre-labeled. Yeah.
Yeah, so they don't check a box here.
They don't
It's
check a
already done
box, right.
in the system.
It's already done the system. Yeah. And, so it's, just a little tangentially, we run into some of that issue with, our transcripts are legal. So if we have a student in the system who has a gender identification that is different than the legal gender identification from when they entered school, we have the ability to change it in our system and keep the legal data, but we have to print a transcript with the legal data.
So when the students are administered this test, they just get a sheet of paper, they don't have to
It's
have
on
their
a
ID.
computer.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
yes,
And
right.
they log in with their state, what's called the SSID.
So they don't have to identify themselves as anything.
They have to type in this number.
Ethnicity or, yeah.
Well, it does come up and say, is this you? So it'll come up and say, Tara, is this you? And it'll say, Taratopia 15.
Okay, so I'm just trying to think about, put
Yeah.
myself in the student's
And-
spot.
Yeah, I would say that a lot of this type of assessing is behind the curve. I do expect them to catch up, but right now, it's tough. eSchool just caught up, I think, last year, where we were able to make some changes, because everything links. Like for us, Google Docs, all of that link through eSchool. So if we can't put the preferred name in eSchool, then it's blasted out everywhere. Okay, here's special education. Again, a pretty stark difference here. And then here is the ELL scores. This is for math by proficiency level. And I think, when you look here, for our fairly newcomers, because, and this is a change from the old test. The old test was pretty much numbers and stuff, and we used to see where we had a lot of EL students who could still score pretty well on the math assessment, but this math assessment is literacy heavy. It does require a lot of reading and writing. So some implications. As we said, some gains were made, particularly our African-American students improved their ELA scores for the third consecutive year, which is promising. They improved their math scores by 14 percentage points over last year. And a greater percentage of students scored and standard exceeded on the ELA portion of the assessment in 11th grade than they did in 8th. So those were sort of some of the bright spots from the data this year. Areas of growth. As I said, overall as a district, we were down this year. So we've got some examination to do. We need to dive into some of those claim areas and find out where we need to shore up our curriculum and instruction. And our achievement gaps remain, and they're still predictable. Although they are improving for particularly our African American students, our low socioeconomic students, I think we need to dive a little more deeply into. AVID is a program that is aimed at that particular population. So we're just in our second year of implementation, so we're hoping to continue to see some improvement, and we're marking that, we're sort of monitoring AVID by GPA scores. So we're, students that are in AVID now, what is their GPA at this semester compared to the year before if they weren't in AVID? So seeing those kinds of progress. So San Andreas had the lowest percentage of students who scored at or above standard in both ELA and math. I think we have to also remember that San Andreas has an overrepresentation of low SES and special education. I think it's really important to note that actually San Andreas right now, I believe, it's over 20% special education, so that is twice the district average.
And can I just add that just because that 20% is legally special ed doesn't mean the rest of the population has other challenges that they present as well.
Yeah, but I think when you look at the special ed scores and realize what percentage of the students at San Andreas are special ed, I think we're making some connections. And our data has been fairly consistent over the last two administrations. So we know where to look, and we are trying to apply solutions to these areas. Again, our primary LCAP goal is to improve the learning of all students while narrowing our achievement and opportunity gaps. And while we're doing some of that, we're not achieving all of that, but that will remain our focus. And this, again, we've talked before about why high levels of achievement is important. There's a lot of conversation out there now around should high schools in California align their graduation requirements to A to G. And there's some compelling conversations around that. And then there's some, because California has this A to G system that is in place, and that the supposition is if you graduate A to G eligible, then you are college ready. But we're really trying to dive into is like, what does it mean to be college ready? What we would like is our students to leave our system, whether they go to a 2 or 4 year college, and not have to remediate. That is the goal. Because what we know is if they have to remediate, they're far less likely. It is a huge uphill battle if you have to remediate even one level. If you have to remediate 2 levels, you're not, your chances drop to about 17% to graduate. So, the A to G conversation is happening. We understand why a college degree is valuable in this country, and I think it's hard to deny that it's not. It does direct correlation to income, and as we see, we have, highly educated people who can't afford to live in Marin County because the average cost of a 1-bedroom is $3,300 a month, and that's a pretty high bar.
When you say remediate 1 level versus 2, can you define level?
Sorry, yes. So 1 level means that I can take 1 math class and then enter into a credit-bearing math class.
So it's per course, it's
Per
not
course,
okay.
right.
Thank you.
So if I have to take 2 courses before I even get to a credit-bearing course, I don't get credit for those 2 classes that are considered below college grade level. So I'm paying for them, I'm working, and I then have to pass these 2 classes, and then I can try the credit-bearing class. So, when you think about that, if I'm a year into my endeavor before I'm even taking 1 college, credit-bearing class in that area. And then those can be gatekeepers. If I have to pass this math class to get into these other areas that I'm trying to study, it really starts to compound. Yeah.
Does the college, for example, College of Marin, issue their own mathematical assessment to determine remediation?
They do.
My
And
concern is this
Yeah.
with that. Many years ago, I remember we had very difficult numbers. Our kids were going into Cal, actually, with a lot of remediation. And what we found out was Cal got a tremendous grant to build their departments around remediation. So guess what? We found more kids who needed remediation. So I'm just, are we, when our kids leave here and then they go to college and run for this assessment, is there some is it on a continuum?
there
So
is.
that
We
they're-
do collaborate with them, and actually, the Compass program that is housed at TAM right now grew out of that exact conversation, like how do we make sure that kids are prepared to enter our system and be successful? And it is an interesting conundrum, but for them, they want to have high graduation and transfer rates. So they don't want to have high dropout rates either, because that doesn't reflect well on them. So they do have, some impetus to have kids be successful. And as we know, this past year, the CSUs shifted the way they did things, and some of the Cal State schools were going to no longer offer remedial classes. Instead, they were going to require support within credit-bearing classes. So we haven't seen the data on that yet.
Okay, interesting, thank you.
Okay, as we know, it's not just economic. Right, that what we really want is for our students to launch from here in a way that they can be active, engaged citizens, that they can think critically, analytically, and essentially make this the world we want them to be. So, as we said, site administrators, they have the data. They'll use them with their teachers to determine areas of growth in teaching and learning, hopefully focus some of those learning teams on some of these areas. And the math task force is also another layer where we dive into this data. And this is where a lot of the curriculum alignment work happens for math. And last year we focused a lot, Corbett and I were both in that group, and they did a lot of work around advanced algebra previously, and this year they're really focusing on aligning geometry and making sure, because even though it's geometry, they have to sort of keep those algebra skills going, and that's one of the areas that they really wanted to shore up and make sure all of the geometry teachers were in alignment with what they're supposed to be teaching to what depth. Questions?
I have another request for next steps, and I'm wondering if the rest of the board is on board with this. When we have the county and state data, could staff report back on how we compare to
Oh, yeah.
to the county and the state? I heard Leslie mention that a couple times.
Yeah, I don't think I had that until March last year. Hopefully I'll have it sooner this year. But yes.
Thank you.
And I don't know that this would have to be comprehensive, but so often during these discussions, we touch upon, and you raise some very good examples that lend uncertainty to the data, and it gives it a little bit of perspective. And it might be nice to include or capture some of those items in one slide, partly because these slides, they live a long time. And it's always a good reminder that we have to be careful when we look at this data, what conclusions we really draw from it.
Sure.
I do have one more question. Is there any opportunity for students to give feedback to admin after they've taken the test, kind of a debrief? I know there are some rules and regs that say you can't talk about what's in the
Right.
test. I got that, but do we have an opportunity to find out how they're experiencing this exam?
Yeah, I think the teachers in the room, I know that I've administered with Ann a few times, and I mean, we could do something a little more formal, but, it kind of, what I've noticed is it depends on what room you're in and what, I've administered in rooms where they were just prior to AP testing, so it was a lot of like, okay, thanks, that was great. I've been in rooms where kids are like done, and you're like, I haven't sat down yet. What do you mean you're done? And other kids were like really pouring over it. So, I think one of the things we've been trying to instill in students is that it is important for us to be able to capture this data realistically so we really know how we're doing. But yeah, I think we could ask them a little more specifically.
I wonder if that's appropriate maybe for a student governance group
Mhm.
or student trustees, because I would like to be able to turn to them and say, how did it go?
Mhm.
So that they would look and inquire and
Yeah.
wonder how their colleagues are not
Yeah.
performing, but how they
Well,
took it, how it went.
This was the first year that I heard the feedback from, overheard kids saying to each other, don't try hard because the test then gets easier and you'll be done sooner because it's adaptive.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So if I do well, right, then my next question they get progressively more difficult. And, so I could be in a room with one kid, both kids took the math test and this one had 61 problems and this one had 42. Right, so because it's adaptive, so this was the first time I heard kids catching on to being like, no, don't do that, just don't
So you
answer those
listen for it,
questions.
though,
Yeah,
too. Okay.
right, so they're so crafty. They're really crafty. They know how to make their way around a system every single time.
Thank you.
So,
Any other questions?
No.
Any public comment? Okay, I think you can stay up there, Tara.
One glass of water?
Approve revision to the LCAP
yes.
date
Um,
document.
Yeah, so these are the technical responses and technical revisions to the LCAP. There's a letter that explains more of them. This was the first year we used the template from document tracking systems, which was excellent, but it was also, we had to import it, so some things got imported just to the wrong place, like they just didn't map. So a lot of the technical responses were really like, can you move this to goal 2, because it belongs there? So it was really, there was nothing substantive to the goals, the action steps, or the budget. It was really just rearranging things to put them in the proper place. And then Corbett helping me identify. The LCAP template itself has gotten more specific, so you can really drill down to where in the budget this money is coming from. And Corbett was able to help me with really drilling down to that.
Any discussion or questions?
I think we're going to change this, just make some changes on that template. I think it says it should have your name on it, and I don't think
Yeah,
it does.
so that was the actual LCAP, and when it was adopted,
Right.
there was a different superintendent.
Right.
Right. It's a 3-year plan. The LCAP itself is a 3-year plan, so.
Any public comment? No. Can I ask for a motion then to approve the revisions to the LCAP?
I move we adopt the revisions to the LCAP.
Second?
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. So next, we have the first reading of child abuse prevention and reporting.
Yep, so this is me again. So this came up unfortunately. And when Wes and I were discussing a certain incident, we pulled up the board policy and realized that it hadn't been updated since 1993. One of our goals this year is whenever we reference a board policy, we'll look at the last time it was updated and make sure, that's one way that we're going to cull through them to make sure that we're updating them. So, a quick overview. A lot's changed since 1993. Most specifically, I would say the best way to put it is the language is more proactive than reactive about reporting abuse and neglect. Again, I would point out that our Keenan modules this year actually spoke to this, which I thought was a big improvement. It also brought current definitions of mandated reporter and obligations that we need to fulfill regarding how we report. I did have a question asking if board members are mandated reporters, and the answer is no, you're not. You're not because you are not directly, you would be if you directly supervised students. but because you don't directly supervise students, you're not mandated reporters. Now, we would hope that if you saw anything, you would report it, but you're not mandated by law.
And who do we report to?
Me?
Okay.
Yeah.
Is
And then,
this
so once you report something to me, though, I am a mandated reporter. So then I have to go further.
Could
So
I-
by updating this, is this circulated to then to all the employees? And, or is this
we
something
we
already
could-
part of your,
It's part of our, it's like the student handbook, so.
so
you know,
it's already
in the-
there? We're this is
Yeah.
just.
But we will
now
put it in our, and when you do approve it, we will put it in our board update that we send out to everybody saying, hey,
Okay.
this policy's been updated, you might want to check out the new language. And this will be more in line with what our teachers have seen in their recent Keenan training and things like that. Well, all staff, not just teachers.
I just wanted to note that on the agenda, Wes was supposed to be talking about this, and I think that
Yeah.
I just wanted to thank you for sending him home, which I bet is what happened.
Yes.
So I like that we're thinking about taking care of families.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
He has a sick child at home, as Michael has this cold, yes. Maybe Wes gave it to you, Michael, via his kid.
This is a generous man.
I have a question about the Keenan. And this is, sounds weird maybe, but has anyone who has taken the Keenan class, whatever you call them,
Training.
thank you, thank
Yeah.
you, ever reported being triggered?
I do believe the Keenan modules have trigger warnings at the start of them.
Okay.
They say this module will talk about things that are of a sensitive nature, if you know, I believe they have trigger warnings at the beginning of them.
I did not notice when I looked at the sexual harassment one, that I didn't see a trigger warning there, and I think there should be one.
Yeah, I'll check,
that one,
because
too.
That term, that, now that you bring it up, trigger warning, I'm thinking with all of the challenges that we have in the schools now, if there can be a different term besides trigger.
Yeah, I don't know what
I don't know what the synonym would be, but
reaction.
a warning.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're not taking action tonight. This is the first
first read.
reading.
So we'll bring this back on the 25th
Okay, thank you.
for our second read.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll move on to holding the public hearing, so I'm supposed to recess for the public hearing. There, I recessed for the public hearing, sufficiency of instructional materials, and adopt resolution 18-7 certifying sufficient instructional materials. Any comment, any public comment?
On instructional materials? Yeah, there's computer shortages.
You have to come to the podium.
Okay.
Sorry about that. And identify yourself, please.
Sue Fox, parent, former parent,
No,
taxpayer.
you're a parent still.
I'm still a parent, but my child's not in the district anymore. Teacher and instructional coach for the district. And we have a shortage of computers now that we're doing bring your own device. We don't necessarily have a device for everyone that can't afford it. And not everyone has their own printer at home to print all the documents that teachers are now asking them to do at home. So I'm speaking for those who don't afford.
No, I appreciate that.
Mhm.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The money we spend on IT, we don't have enough.
Okay, now we'll close the public hearing and move on to item F, approve the 2017-18 unaudited actual financial report.
Oh, here we go.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, Mr.
Thank you. Have a good wait time. I was going to wait for as long as necessary. All right, so we're going to talk about our 2017-18 unaudited actuals. So while we're living the present and moving forward, this is one of the times we're going to look backwards. We're going to look into last year. It's one of our last major viewings of last year's fiscal situation. We're going to talk about where we landed compared to where we estimated and the implications of that. So here we go. So why do this? Again, this is our last major look back on last fiscal year. We're going to be looking at actual revenues and expenditures, emphasizing actual. Not budgeted or projected or estimated. These are actual numbers. You're going to see less K's and less M's for thousands of millions. You're going to see actual dollar amounts because they're actuals. Budget adoption, first interim, second interim, estimated. Those are all projections, estimations, but this is an actual. And then later on, we're going to compare those actuals to our last estimation, which were estimated actuals in June, a couple months ago to budget adoption. So that's going to be the comparison point. We're going to see where we estimated, see where we landed up, what's the difference, the rationale behind that, and what does that mean moving forward. The goal from speaking for the business office is we want to have accurate budget projections. Accuracy means we're using our limited resource as best as possible for student learning. Accuracy is a relative term. We want that to be as close to zero as possible, and I don't think I'll ever be here long enough and get to zero, but I want to be as close to zero as possible. That number, not to be too much late, is relative to the variance, the difference between the estimated and actuals is divided by the overall budget number, $90 million. So it's a relative term. Either black or red numbers, meaning accurate, doesn't differentiate necessarily. That's relative to, is it for the better, for the worst, but we're trying to get close to zero. The difference, whatever that difference will be, we'll get to in a little bit. As I mentioned last board meeting, that will impact our starting fund balance for this year. It will adjust that one way or another. It's not going to impact this current year's operating deficit whatsoever, just our starting value of our fund balance. And we're primarily going to focus on our unrestricted areas for analysis. Unrestricted is where we have discretion, control. Again, restricted is where there's defined restrictions for use. Those things will carry over. And last, we do this because it's required by law. So just want to set a little bit of context. Agenda, I'm going to run through these things. I'm not going to read that to you, but there's some things we must disclose and some things we want to. We're going to see this as we move forward. So just a little review, and this is imperative, why the difference between basic aid and state-funded LCFF districts. Again, we are a basic aid district because our property taxes exceed the entitlement we would receive on the state's LCFF funding formula. So our property taxes exceed that, and the difference is we don't get additional funding for every student that comes in. And given, as you all know by now, we're in an enrollment growth district, we don't get additional funding primarily. It's based on the growth of the property taxes. Why does that come into play, you say? Well, because there are some pieces of our funding or revenue that are driven by ADA. I'm trying to avoid acronyms, but again, ADA is average daily attendance. That's actually who's showing up, attending our schools, not who's enrolled in classes, who's actually showing up. And this is based off of the P2 attendance data from last school year, and we showed a growth of 190 students from the year prior. Again, that's ADA. Our enrollment growth is beyond that. Again, the ADA doesn't significantly impact things because we're basic aid. And our property taxes, which are our primary driver, were $59.6 million last year. That's a 3.1 increase from the year prior, or a 5.2% increase. Notice that 0.2 in a little bit. That 0.2 is going to come up later in the presentation in a positive way. So let's just quickly review where our sources for general revenue from last school year. General purpose is kind of a catch-all term, but those are our property taxes primarily. EPA, Education Protection Account, you'll hear more about that later, another agenda item, and minimum state aid. We also get additional state funding that is based off of the ADA amounts we have, lottery money, restricted special ed money, for example. Our federal funding, our titles, Title I, Title II, is primarily based off of ADA and socioeconomic rates. And our local revenues are the parcel tax, the current parcel tax we have, and our wonderful foundations that they donate to us, and facility fees, et cetera. So just give you a quick review of our total combined revenue sources. I do want to quickly highlight and remind that some of those revenue sources are unrestricted and some are restricted. Restricted meaning it has a very specific purpose for the funding, and that's what it can only be used for. Examples could be special education, could be those Title I funds, could be facilities funds. So we don't have complete control over the restricted funding. Unrestricted funding, that's discretionary. So I just want a quick reminder that the difference between the two. EPA, or Education Protection Account, I'm not going to touch as much on that now, but I'm required to disclose our EPA accounting for this year. We'll have a resolution in the next agenda item. But the purpose of the EPA account was after the Great Recession, 2012, when many, many school districts were struggling tremendously. The voters approved Prop 30, which provided special protected funding that can only be used for instructional purposes. So for 17-18, our EPA revenues were $918,000, $458, and we use it entirely for instructional salaries and related benefits. We do have a minor ending balance, and that will roll over and be spent immediately this year. Let's now flip to expenditures. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but again, I want to highlight there's unrestricted and restricted expenditures, much like I talked about with revenues. And the total combined expenditures are related to people, salaries and benefits, as we would expect. Quick differentiation between unrestricted expenditures and the combined, if you look at the tables. On the left side is the unrestricted, where 87% of our expenditures are people, salary and benefits. That's because on the restricted side, we have often more items that are un-people related. Special ed, non-public school placements, for example, some of our larger portable costs are associated there. So just want to share those two data points briefly. So contributions and transfers. This is where funding can flow differently from our unrestricted to our restricted or to another fund. So let's define what a contribution out is. A contribution is when funding goes from unrestricted to restricted, all within the general fund. So on the top left are the examples of our larger bucket item contributions. As we know, special ed is one of our biggest contributors from unrestricted to restricted. Both the program itself, transportation, and the bill back from MCOE, who provides some special ed services to our students. Carl Perkins, which is like voc ed, Title III immigration, educator effectiveness, and routine restrictive maintenance is a large one. That's almost entirely related to the portables that we put in this summer. On the other side are transfers. Again, transfer is funding from the general fund to another fund. That's what the word transfer means. I want to highlight a couple of them. The name of Fund 11 is called the Adult Education Fund, but that's a little bit misleading. That's where community ed and adult ed both live. They are separate budget strands. They operate separately. And that transfer of $450,000 is almost exclusively community ed. So I want to highlight that. That can be a little bit misleading if you just look at the formal title of the fund. The cafeteria, we have a transfer in as well, deferred maintenance.
Can I stop and ask a question?
Absolutely.
Does funding that we receive for adult ed pay for 100% of the costs of adult ed?
Yes.
What about community ed?
No, we do not receive any state funding for community ed. That funding comes from two sources, our general fund and the revenues raised by the community ed program itself. Facilities fees, summer camp revenues, evening classes. So no state funding for community ed.
So we've talked in the past about evaluating the fees that we charge to reduce the amount of, for field rental, for example, to reduce the amount of contribution from unrestricted general funds. Do you know what the status of that is? And if so, can you inform us?
Absolutely. So Tara Larson and I have talked about this quite a bit. I've met with Chris McCune 4 times since I've been in my new position. who's the director of community ed. So we've done an analysis of where our fee rates are and where they comply with the Civic Act. The Civic Act is there's a cap on the fees we can charge to a public facility, given that our schools are publicly funded. There are some limitations of how far we can raise the fees. Chris acknowledged that there's some areas where we can raise the fees, and he's working on that this year. That's going to be a goal of his. But there are other areas where it's already maxed out under the limitations of the Civic Act.
So, do you have a sense as to, well, is that 450, how much are we spending on community ed right now? What's the deficit, do you know, of, let me see if I can get it out. What's the deficit with respect to which our community ed program is operating? And what will be the impact of these anticipated changes in fee structure on that deficit?
I can't give you the answer to the latter and what the changes in fee rates would be. I can share that if after meeting with Chris, if you look at the different buckets of his program, he puts into summer camp, the summer programs, lap swimming, general facilities usages, and evening classes. All of the three of those four programs break even or actually turn a profit relative, except for one that has is almost entirely the deficit related to that, and that's the evening classes that are run. So Chris and I have looked at that, talked about that, and that's definitely going to be an area where we're going to have to look to make some changes.
Yeah. So we've had, prior to your start in this position, we've had a number of discussions about costs associated with the swimming program, in particular, the impact of keeping the temperature of the pools at a certain temperature on our equipment. And I think that part of that is probably due to the community ed, the community's use of our pools. So I just want to make sure that when you're doing your cost analysis, that you take that into account as well.
Duly noted.
Because we're turning over our, as it's been explained to us, we're turning over our equipment at a faster rate than one would generally expect, and that's part of the reason for it.
Lars, David O'Connor, and I met on Friday to look at our facilities, some of our athletic fields, and some big ticket items, and there's no doubt that the community ed usage is something that can accelerate the deterioration of some of our facilities.
I have a follow-up question on community ed. And that is, I'm just thinking big picture up in the helicopter here. How long has community ed been our responsibility in the district? And why does it reside in the high school district versus, say, at the College of Marin?
How long has it been a district program? I don't know the answer. I know it goes back well before the 80s, just based on my knowledge of it. I can't speak to that. Barbara, do you want to, as you nodding, do you want to add to that? Yeah.
It goes way back, beyond the 80s,
Yep.
or way further.
The adult school is in its 95th year, believe it or not, so that goes way back as well, and they've kind of been interwoven.
I mean, I moved here in '73, and the community ed things were in my mailbox then.
Yeah. I don't want to go too birdwalking. In the 90s with Bob Yates and some other, it was from my understanding, extremely robust program. There wasn't, my understanding, as much competition from the local towns, Larkspur, Corte Madera, with their parks and recs. Those weren't quite as big, so I think we were a larger provider of that, is my understanding. That being said, we're at a different place now, most certainly. And we've had open conversations with Chris and directors in Larkspur and Corte Madera with our Park and Recs department. Where are some ways we can share this? Given the numbers, and that was before we looked at the stark numbers of the programs that I referenced, it's just imperative we have to look at that and look at a shared services model because given our mission, given our financial situation, we have to put our dollars that are most aligned to that. So how do we partner with our Larkspur, Corte Madera, Parks and Recs departments potentially.
Just wondering if, like Novato and San Rafael school districts, if their districts also float community ed programs. I'm seeing Lars shaking his head big time, that we are providing community ed for much of southern Marin. And I'm wondering if we get any kind of help from our neighbors. That may be this may be a whole other agenda item, but given that it looks like community ed is primarily responsible for that big number and that row, why is that and what can we do?
Yeah, I think we'll be coming back sooner or later and identifying what are the programs that are neutral or actually turn a little profit, and what are the ones that we need to spin off. And that will directly address that number. Anything else in community ed? Additionally, the cafeteria fund. That is another significant transfer that we need to look at, and Lars and I have already spent some time with the nutrition director and identify what are some possible ways to reduce that as well. The deferred maintenance, the capital facilities, special capital outlay fund, those are choices that we transfer to, and that's a purposeful transfer given that we need to maintain our facilities, and we still have been building portables. Whether we choose to in the future or not is to be determined. But we've been a district that has chosen to continue to set aside funding for deferred maintenance, even when the legal requirement went away. That legal requirement now has come back, and so that is not an increase per se for us. It's just been a continued of our own internal practice. So these, again, the contribution transfers are areas that put stress on our unrestricted general fund. We'll see these numbers a little bit in comparison to where we thought we would be. So now we get to the comparison piece. The numbers you just saw were actual dollars that were spent or transferred or contributed. Now we're going to get into comparing the actual dollars to where we estimated in June, a couple months ago, where we thought we'd be. So I just want to lay out kind of the context for this. Again, we want to be as accurate as possible. The general rule of thumb in the industry, if you're plus or minus 1%, that is fantastic. If you think about your own personal budget, if you nailed where you thought you'd be and deliver on that 12 months later, given the unexpected things that happen, within plus or minus 1% is great. In the context of our budget, plus or minus 1% is $644,000. Not an insignificant amount of money, but relative to the overall budget, putting that into context. Good is plus or minus, again, red or black, 1.28 million. And just okay is plus or minus 3%. So I just want to put that in a little bit of context, what we're trying to do. So when we look back and compare our estimated actuals in June to our unknown actuals tonight, we're going to see that we have an overall savings in the black. And that unrestricted variance or difference between the two numbers is just under 1.3 million. That 1.3 million compared to our unrestricted expenditures is about 1.97%. So if you compare that to the criteria, that's in the good phase. On the restricted side,
So I just want to make sure, are you taking credit for this? I mean, how long you been in this job?
I am not taking credit for this. I'm not taking
We're
credit
more
for
than
this.
willing to give you the credit. Since nobody else is here from finance.
Well, on a serious note, given some of the turnover in my office and some of the stresses we're in, I think that that's an important thing to see, that we land in an area that's within the good amount. I think that speaks to staff in the business office, to be honest, that really worked hard over the summer. And I'll come back to in a little bit. The summer is the most intensive time in the business office, so I do want to give them a little bit of a shout out. But that's an important that we came in within something reasonable range. I do want to highlight, again, the restricted side. We have just over $2 million of savings, but again, restricted, there's a explicit use for all those savings. Big chunk of that is the California Clean Energy Jobs Act that David O'Connor's working on. We must expend those funds by June 30th of this fiscal year, and we will. And another huge chunk are just local foundations grants, and that's more of a cash flow. They provide the funding before the year's out, but for the following year, so that shows up as a restricted budget saving. So, again, getting back to our criteria, this is where we ended up being in the good phase. 1.27 million for the better savings is just under 2%. Numerically, breaking that out a little bit more. Again, in June, our estimated operating deficit was predicted to be about $6.3 million in the red. That $1.3 million we just identified offsets that. But our actual operating deficit for last school year, for 17-18, is still just an unrestricted, just under $5 million, which is still significant. So I'm just putting things into context. Now, what are the components of that $1.3 million? We'll get into that in the next slide. So how do we break out that $1.3 million? The property taxes. Remember I said, remember that 0.2 of extra property taxes? We budgeted 5%, which is what the county assessor's office provides guidance on. The 5.2%, 0.2 of our property taxes relates to $523,000. Overall unrestricted expenditure savings across various areas came back to $492,000. The far bulk of that was at the sites, which I find interesting. There was no direction to spend less. I speculate that given some of the conversations in the winter or spring with our larger financial situation, I wonder if people chose to spend less, consciously or not. But I think that's a credit to our staff being mindful. Our contributions to restricted resources were less or better, $440,000. That's primarily special ed. Unfortunately, our transfers out to other funds were more than estimated. Community ed, nutrition, some of those other areas, 273 for the worst. The other, the 87K for the better, just a million little things add up to that, but all that together washes out to be 1.3 million for the better. So again, our estimated operating deficit was 6.3 million, offset that by 1.3 million, so we're still have an operating deficit of $5 million in 2017-18. I'm not going to talk through this much, but we're required to disclose how our reserve is allocated. Again, that $1.3 million goes to our starting fund balance for 2018-19. So our starting fund balance we predicted in June was to be 16.4 million. The 1 plus the 1.3 is now 17.7 million to start the school year on the unrestricted side. The restricted side still the 2.2 we just saw, breaks down in those various areas. I'm not going to get into that. But our reserve is at the 16% level, which is almost just slightly above where we predicted it to be in June. But again, the reserve is scheduled to be reduced by 7.9 million this upcoming school year, which is our operating deficit that we budgeted for this school year. If we just look at our other funds, so general fund is the top one, both unrestricted and restricted combined. It's going down $5 million from where we were a year ago to June 30th this year. Again, adult education fund is primarily adult ed and community ed. There's some minor changes there. The biggest one I want to point out is the special reserve fund for capital outlay went down by 1.4 million. That is the fund that we use almost exclusively for our portables that we did over the work we did this past summer. The primary red number is the general fund for the reasons we discussed. So next steps.
Can I ask you about the portables? So
Sure.
money that's being spent now is not in this budget. It would be
Correct.
It would be for this existing year's budget.
So given that construction work is primarily done in the summer, which the fiscal year divides right down the middle, July 1st.
Right.
So the portals is done last summer from July 1st to August. A portion of that's captured in here.
Right.
And then late June to July 1st were captured. So all the construction work that was done post July 1st will show up 1 year from now.
Okay. Can we go back to the prior slide, please?
Sure. This one?
Yes. So the current budget is projected to have the current budget, taking into account the increase in our, in the, so what's the equivalent of the ending fund balance
The
for the
beginning
coming
fund
year, the
balance.
beginning fund balance?
So this, we predicted in June that our starting fund balance for this school year
Right.
would be 16.4 million. That was in the budget tip sheet. That's what I've been using in my budget update to sites.
So, I understand. Okay, so taking into account our starting fund balance, right, which takes into account this additional almost $2 million,
Correct.
right?
1.3.
Right. Notwithstanding that fact, we're still projected to be deficit spending by nearly $8 million.
So 1 year from now, we're projecting right now that this number will go down by that number.
Okay, so even with the parcel tax, additional revenue from the parcel tax.
No, this does not show any additional revenue.
I understand.
Oh, gotcha, sorry.
Even assuming, for the sake of this discussion, that the parcel tax passes and we have an additional $5.1 million of revenue,
Correct.
that means we still, if we're not going to be deficit spending for this year, we would still need to cut expenses by somewhere between $2.5 and $3 million.
We've stated we're sticking to our goal of if the parcel tax passes, which would offset that $8 million by $5 million, we still have a stated goal of identifying $3 million of cost reductions for this school year. And then a couple slides, I'll speak to some actions taken for that. If the parcel tax doesn't pass, our stated goal is then to close that, because if we don't, that number is still, we're going to be depleted by 2020, 21.
Okay.
The 1.3 million that this increased by, unfortunately, buys us a couple more months into 2020, 21 before we get depleted. We pay roughly $5 million a month in payroll from that context. So we're a people-based business. So next steps, again, I do want to formally and publicly give a shout out to the business staff, office staff. When we go away for the summer and enjoy much as our summer break, that's when they really crank into overdrive. Closing the books, doing budget adoption, coming back. They've had 3 different supervisors in that period of time. So I just want to publicly give them a shout out. They did a tremendous job working hard to get this to where we want it to be. Next, the auditors will come in. November 7th and 8th, I just found out this week that Christie White, which is our auditing firm, will come in and do their field work. They'll render an opinion to staff by December 15th, and we will bring that audit report to the board in January.
How many years have they done the audit?
Christie White has done it with us for at least 2 years. Christie White herself is a former partner in the auditing firm that we used to use, that I'm blanking on the name of. So Negro and White. So this is at least our 2nd year with this firm. So just a little budget update. Now, pivoting from looking to last school year to this school year, just a little update as I'm trying to do every board meeting on the work that's been done so far. Again, as Michael alluded to, we have our stated goal of a net of $3 million of savings. I'm going to emphasize the word net for a reason in a moment. Since last time we were here, given the appointment of our new superintendent, and that we're not replacing her currently, we will see a savings of $246,000. That is ongoing until we change otherwise. And a one-time cost savings of $500,000 for the return of the superintendent's housing loan. And I'm emphasizing one-time. One-time money is not ongoing, so while that will kind of offset our reserve, I'm not counting that one-time money towards our $3 million of savings, because those need to be ongoing savings. It's not like we're going to get a $500,000 loan returned every year, unfortunately.
We can try.
We can try, we can ask.
And just for the record, we have been paid back in full.
In full.
Yeah.
And that will, well, I'll get to them, that will show up in December. Yep, that happened We have accrued some additional costs since the last time we were here because we have additional students requiring special ed transportation. We've had to increase our budget expenses for $136,000, given 17 and a half students that do need transportation. So that's hence the word net up above. If you think about the 136,000 additional costs, now we have to have $3,136,000, the net being $3 million of savings.
How do we get a half of an IEP student?
You know what, Chuck, I actually thought about that same question.
One-way transportation.
Hmm?
Sometimes it's just one-way transportation.
Okay.
Yeah, or I was thinking if it was some days in a week, yeah.
Yeah.
I was wondering about that myself. Thank you. And then in December will be an important presentation where I'll bring our first interim budget update for this current school year. That's going to accrue all the cost savings we've been describing in these budget updates throughout the entire fall. Any additional costs that may come up, I'm highlighting the big ticket items that we're obviously aware of. There'll be smaller ones for the better, for the worse. And obviously we'll have our partial tax measure results. The additional hopefully $5.1 million of revenue or not. And then accordingly the updated multi-year projection. So I'm meeting with Kate Lane and Tarina Mars tomorrow to talk about where we're at, next steps, get their feelings on the process we set out, and to take their feedback and support. So I'm looking forward to having that meeting tomorrow. That's my presentation. Barbara.
Does the Budget Study Committee work with this current information then? Will they get this to work with?
So the fiscal advisory group?
Yes, fiscal advisory, excuse me.
Yes. So last board meeting, I presented my budget update presentation. That was based off of the June information we had. I presented that literally the night before the board meeting. So what I'll do is I'll give an update the figures that we'll be operating with accordingly.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Any public comment? No, thank you very much. It was very clear.
Thank you.
Really appreciated that.
Thank you.
So the next agenda item is adopt resolution 18-8,
Correct,
GAN
Ron?
limits.
Sorry, Leslie. I think we have to.
Oh, it's approved.
Yeah, I
I'm
think we
sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd ask for a motion to approve the 2017-18 unaudited actuals financial report.
I move we approve the 2017 unaudited actual financial report.
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
That passed. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we'll move on to the adoption of the GAN limits.
Thank you. The next two agenda items should be pretty brief. They're items that come to before every public school board every year. In brief, I'm not going to read it to you, but the GAN resolution was passed and named after a man, Paul Gann, in the 70s, who, from my understanding, had concerns about the increasing growth of government expenditures, including public schools. And he was able to successfully put on the ballot and have passed by the voters of California in 1979, Proposition 4, which basically states that the growth of a government agency of spending cannot exceed certain growth rates. It's a calculation based on the ADA of a school district. And Mary, I don't know if you have it available, but we have to do a calculation for what would have been our GAN limit, our appropriation limit under, it's this one right here. It's okay if you can't find it. Long story short, the GAN limit is roughly $75.5 million of appropriations from the state. I can confirm and affirm that our allocations to the state are at $69 million, which do not exceed the GAN limit statute. So we are in compliance with that.
I move that we adopt resolution 18-8 GAN limits.
I second it.
All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Oh, it's a resolution. Is this a roll call?
Yeah.
Oh, roll call.
It's a roll call.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Ms. Anderson,
Aye.
Mr. Bowman,
Aye.
Ms. Owens,
Aye.
Mr. Ford,
Aye.
And Ms. Harlander.
Aye, thank you. It passed. And now we'll go on to approving the Resolution 18-10.
Thank you. So the Education Protection Account, or EPA, as I mentioned in the actuals presentation, was based off of Prop 30 in 2012. The voters approved having some protected funding that can only be used for instructional purposes. It cannot be used to offset administrative costs, overhead costs, as a result coming out of the Great Recession of earlier in the decade. As the memo states, we received $918,458 in revenues, and we expended all of that but $5,000, which is an ending balance that we'll expend immediately. And I can verify that all of that was used for instructional salaries, instructional benefits, and it was in complete compliance with the requirements of the EPA account.
I have a question,
Please.
but it's really tangential, because you mentioned it in the last few slides, the Great Recession 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
What are you hearing from your connections with financial services, with economic outlooks and so on?
Mhm.
Are you hearing anything in terms of the next one? Any predictions?
Acknowledging I'm not an economic expert, but what I've gathered, California has been relatively a boom or bust state every 10 years with the excessive boom and then a bust. We are at one of the largest economic growths in the nation and in California in quite some time. My understanding, if you look at the governor's budget and the May revised, there's some language in there that shows that while we are still growing, those growth rates are beginning to slow down. I think there's also concerns about the federal government's tax plan that came out that reduced the mortgage deductions for, there's a cap. So that's from a larger state. Locally, from the real estate property value, that's obviously a very important indicator to us. Again, my casual amateur readings of those reports is that while property values are high, the volume of sales are still relatively low. So that's a mixed bag. The value is high, great, but the volume doesn't turn over the property, so therefore, because of Prop 13, the assessed values for homeowners, they're not being recessed up when they're sold. So a little bit of a mixed bag there.
Thank you.
I have a
One thing I just want to add, Roy Given is our major, he's the director of finance for the county office. He's been a tremendous resource to my office. I met with him, scheduled an hour meeting. He spent almost 2 hours just helping us out with parcel tax, advice, guidance. He's a gem of a man.
I have a question about the carryover of 5,000, which is tiny, and I think if I recall correctly, in previous years, we use up the full entitlement and don't have a carryover. I might not be remembering right, but I seem to recall that it always was down to zero, and I'm wondering, there's plenty of ways to spend $5,000 on our people, and I'm wondering why we have a carryover.
I can't compare to past. I just know when you're looking at salaries and benefits and when you're looking at retroactive with salary summits, there's a lot of moving parts when you predict it. I don't know the exact rationale for that $5,000, to be honest with you, but I can guarantee we'll be using that for.
It'll go fast.
It's probably gone already, and we'll be in compliance with it. Yeah. And so next year, when I come here, the beginning fund balance will be $4,891.
Okay.
Can I ask for a motion to adopt Resolution 18-10?
I move we adopt resolution number 18-10 regarding the education protection account.
Is there a second?
Second it.
All those in favor, please wait. We're going to do a roll call vote.
Ms. Anderson?
Aye.
Mr. Futterman?
Aye.
Ms. Owens?
Aye.
Mr. Ford?
Aye.
And Ms. Harlander?
Aye, thank you. That passed.
Thank you, everyone.
We're now going to recess to hold a public hearing, TFT Sunshine Articles for Tamalpais Union High School District negotiations. Is there any public comment?
Was Corbett here last?
It appears so.
I just want to point out a date mistake in the agenda. We are actually negotiating for the 2018-19 school year, and the agenda says 2019-20. And I would also like to just point out that in the previous board meeting, when TUHSD sunshined, that same error was in the agenda then and should probably be corrected on the record.
Thank you.
Oh, you got it, okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Got
you.
it now. Yeah, I didn't see it at first. Any other public comment? Okay, we will return. Now we're on to agenda item J, adopt resolution 18-11 declaring the futility of public bidding for bid number 59.
Thank you very much. Before I begin, I just want to note that it's tough when your young colleague refers to the GAN initiative as if it's ancient history. When I was working on that.
I was noticing that
yeah,
too, actually.
Yeah, essentially
Yeah.
it's a supplement to Proposition
Yeah.
13. But yeah, he talked about it like it was, the Declaration of Independence or something like that.
Were you around for that too?
I was born when Eisenhower was president. Yes. Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you, as we're all a little rummy.
Nice to see
When you are involved in construction with the public sector, law requires that if you have change orders that are over 10%, that you would bid out those change orders. However, the state does allow exceptions. Therefore, we bring to the board this evening change orders with an accompanying resolution called the futility resolution, which essentially allows us to bypass public bidding in the interest of completing a project. In very, very brief, at Redwood Village, our interim housing project at Redwood High School, last year, as you recall, we put in 3 portable classroom units. This summer, to account for additional growth, we put in 4. During the course, and we had plans approved, and we'd been through it once before, and it was running very, very smoothly. And literally, not quite in midstream, but the state reclassified the Redwood High School campus to a hazardous area due to the propensity for flooding and potential liquefaction if we have a significant earthquake. So that required new drawings, newly approved by DSA, and now we also need to put those same drawings through the geotechnical division of the state of California, different entity. That all went well, but it does require some additional work that wasn't in the initial bid. Installation of sump pumps under the buildings and restructuring the foundations. So when you walk out there today or this evening or tomorrow, if you have an opportunity, you'll see that the first phase of the portable sit at this elevation and the next phase sit at that elevation. That was not a mistake. That was a requirement, again, to account for potential flooding and so forth. So they are at different elevations, the foundations are different, and different things had to occur. Therefore, the change orders, which do exceed 10%. The 2 change orders total roughly $77,000. You can see the specifics in the document. That also included not just foundation issues or restructuring and so forth, but the ramps have to be longer, different grading and different asphalt configurations. So it was a cascading effect of change. So they're in there. Kids are in there every day. Teachers are working hard. But we have to make some adjustments. So I respectfully request that you pass the futility resolution and the associated change orders.
Any questions?
I have a question, but not about the futility order, and it's more of a generic observation that around change orders, and some of you can help me with this. It just seems like when we've had to go through change orders, we're kind of stuck. I mean, we have to do,
I like Corbett's thermometer visual in his budget presentation. What I've ascertained just in conversation with architects and so forth, and Leslie, this is your world, but in projects, change orders of roughly 3% or so are the norm. That's a win if you can get through a project and have change orders roughly in that window of 3%, maybe a little more than that. 10% is relatively excessive, but again, there was a major wrench thrown into the project as we got this thing going with new requirements per the state. So we do our very best to reduce change orders. I will say that The change orders before you tonight that I ask that you approve are different than they were 2 weeks ago because I didn't accept them, because I thought the mobilization charges were excessive. Because when DSA said stop, the construction company demobilized and then had to come back again once we got approvals. But I felt their charges were excessive to do that, and so we negotiated them down significantly.
Thank you.
Mr. Fetterman?
Yeah, so I have a procedural question. I would just think, this idea of having a declaration of futility, I think could provide a lot of utility in other areas as well. And I was wondering, as we proceed to other issues, if we could keep this tool in our toolbox and bring it out when there was something
I knew you were going to.
particularly futile.
I could tell.
The
Yes.
utility of futility.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's transferabilities,
take
but
another
we'll
cold medicine.
definitely check it out. Yeah,
What's in
definitely
that
check
cough
it out.
drop you're selling?
Corey gave it to me.
As a parent, I could have used.
See, I find this highly useful in all kinds of contexts.
You can adopt it in your private life. Declaration of futility.
I know, it is.
I noted a typo. I don't know if it was, if anybody saw that, but it's on page 2. On the whereas that
Oh,
has
yes, it was the 4th.
May 8th. It's the word did instead of bid.
Yes.
No,
Yeah, it sounds like they got that.
They got it.
From what
Okay.
we'll fix it.
Tara
Thank you,
was
though.
just saying.
Thank you.
Yeah, they got it already, but thank you.
And then this is coming out of Fund 40.
Yes.
So what is the balance in that fund now after presuming we approve these change orders, this resolution?
That I do not know off the top of my head. We can get that information and get it to you.
It's north of $2 million.
Least.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask for a
move.
motion? Here's your moment.
It gives me great pleasure to be able to move that we approve a resolution number 18-11 declaring the futility of, you name it.
Securing a public bid. We'll stay with our original
Oh,
contract.
I'm getting punchy already. Do we have a second?
A second?
All those in favor, please say aye. That's a resolution again.
Thank you
Here we
very
go.
much.
Wait, hold on.
Resolution.
Oh, that's right.
Ms. Anderson,
Roll call.
Aye.
Mr. Fetterman,
Aye.
You have to do the change orders.
Ms. Owens,
Aye.
Mr. Ford,
Aye.
and
You have
Ms.
to approve
Harlander.
these separately.
Aye. I think we're okay,
Fund 40 is 2.5 million.
because it's written.
Okay,
2.5
Do they need to
Here.
approve the change orders separately or not?
we're
It
okay.
was on the, I
Okay.
think we're okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So are we at board communications already? Okay, so now we're moving to board communications. There's nothing to report here. I was going to crack a joke, but I'm not going to. So this is where we move the 2 items for the trustee reports. And this is a time for the trustees to exchange anything with each other that, now that we're able to speak to each other, that we want to share with each other.
Why does it feel like it's later than it is? I attended back-to-school nights at Drake and Tam, and I think a lot of us were there. That was very well attended and good energy on both sites. And I've just been trying to pop into sites here and there and see how things are going, and it seems like things are off to a good start. Leslie and I are on the Measure J committee, campaign committee, and they are ramping up and meeting every week. So things are happening along that front. Stay tuned for emails from me.
Nothing additional.
I I also went to Drake and Tam, report the same. Very thrilled to be reporting the same. We did finally, SB 328 did pass. So start time is at 8:30. I think it's going to be a wait and see in terms of both community and any financial impact. I fail to see how that half an hour at the high school level is going to make some significant differences, but I know Drake has done a tremendous job of thoroughly vetting that idea, so I'm looking forward to hearing from them after they've done their pilot work.
Me too. I'd love to hear the feedback when it ever gets going.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah.
Oh, and thank you to Chuck, who will be attending the JLAC meeting and the efficiency, educational efficiency meeting tomorrow at 7:30 in the morning. Thank you.
Yeah, I too went to Drake and Tam back to school night, so I'll just comment on Tam because that's the most recent one. But I left, I mean, I was just, high as a kite, leaving there. It was, the four class, I went to four classes and then just schmoozed a lot. But Claire Ernst, who's beginning a ethnic studies course, she spent the entire summer reading, working on curriculum. It looks exciting. Aaron Pribble's street law class, 3 sections. Kids are really interested in street law and sort of a back door into getting into law and procedure and all that. Dave Lapp and CTE. There's some really good education going on in this district.
Mhm.
It blew me away. It just blew me away. I shouldn't be, I've known these people for years, but it just, it sometimes, it just takes my breath away. How good some of our stuff is, and how really good some of our teachers are.
No, thank you. I was going to echo or add a little bit to what Laura shared with you about the parcel tax, but you made me think of something else, is that a couple of my daughter's classmates from the graduating class of 2007, she sent me texts with pictures of them. They got Emmy Awards. And it's the CTE program has a really good backstage program as well that you often don't hear about. But when you go through the whole program, you learn lighting, directing. It's amazing responsibility, and 2 of the classmates got Emmys. One I knew was in lighting, and the other one I'm not sure what area he was in, and showed pictures of him. So pretty amazing, building upon what you just said. We have pretty amazing programs. I wanted to add that in terms of the parcel tax, Karen Lobica, I think, now has all your personal emails. I mean, as trustees, we're able to campaign, and there'll be opportunity in September and October to do precinct walks. And in addition, you'll probably be offered the opportunity to go to a phone bank. You'll be getting an email way to, it's almost like a chain letter, but through email, where you use your contacts to keep spreading the word. And then in addition to that, I know that the district is able to provide information in terms of district employees, not saying vote for, Jay, but provide the information. And we'll probably be teaming up trustees with various district administrators to go to events to provide information. And that's coming very soon. We're going to be getting a list of recommended venues or where we get the most bang for the buck from the committee and their consultant, and then in addition, comparing that with some people that have done it recently for Mill Valley. So I can look forward to that. And that's all I have.
Oh, two more things about Tam back to school. Food trucks.
Great idea.
And that's something that Drake and Redwood ought to emulate.
Yeah, that was a good idea.
Drake did burritos.
You know, the PTSA did a fabulous idea.
Yeah,
And also, in the 4 classes I was in, teachers got the message. In every one of them, they pushed the Tam High Foundation.
Yes, yes, yes. And I also, if I can add, I was thrilled to see Drake's approach to the parents, giving them the information about their chronic absence numbers, giving the parents the information that, they're just, the parents are doing the excused absence, which is, deflating their attendance scores. So that was right there, out in front.
right, and I appreciated the letter you sent
Wow.
to the community, Tara.
Yes.
That was very helpful, too. So our next item is for public comment for items not on the agenda. Do we have anyone that would like to make a public comment on any items not on the agenda?
Hi.
Hello.
I have a question that if somebody could get back to me on this. I noticed that in the last board meeting and continues to this board meeting that the approval of purchase orders of $7,500 or more has been removed. And I'm just wondering why that happened and if that's going to continue to be practiced. And I know you can't answer now, but I just asked that somebody gets back to me on that.
Isn't it up
Yep.
there under vendor warrants?
It's just the value change, and that was
okay,
discussed,
yeah.
and
All
we'll,
right.
well, someone will
Okay.
get back to you for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
good.
thank you.
Yeah.
Any other public comment, or I'm going to adjourn the meeting? You sure? Yeah.
We were here for the field trips to make sure everything went okay, because all of a sudden hiking is now considered hazardous and high risk. And so we showed up to be.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
We were
That,
given so much paperwork and concern over the whole summer about it, so we decided to come and make sure everything
Yeah.
went smoothly.
it was on the consent
And
agenda,
it was on
wasn't
the
it?
consent
Yeah,
agenda.
and we approved the
It was approved.
consent
You're good.
agenda. I am so sorry.
I just want to say that now, I mean, it was one thing when it was camping overnight, I could understand. And I could understand maybe their water sports needs a super waiver, but now hiking is high risk, it's getting like out of hand. It's like, it's getting crazy. These kids have been hiking since they were toddlers on backpacks with their parents and stuff. I mean, it's-
We can respond.
So I'm assuming that
Yeah.
Tara can respond to that.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Meeting adjourned.